Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever need to grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Dale Larson. Dale is professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. He, a clinician and researcher, he is a Fulbright scholar, a fellow in the American Psychological Association, and member of the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. His publications on end-of-life issues, stress in professional caregivers, grief and grief counseling, and the health effects of secret keeping are widely cited, both in the scientific literature and in the popular media. And he was senior editor and a contributing author for the Finding Our Way, Living with Dying in America national newspaper series that reached 7 million Americans. He is the author of The Helper's Journey, Empathy, Compassion, and the Challenge of Caring, and received the Association for Death Education and Counseling Death Educator Award in 2016, and in 2018 was honored as an Innovator of Hospice and Palliative Care by the National Hospice Foundation. Dale, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Well, thank you so much, Andy and Fran. I'm delighted to be here. It's really a pleasure. So thanks for having me join you.
Of course. So we're so excited to dive into your work. But before we do that, those that are listening to us, they always love to know if there's a personal story that actually led you to this work.
Well, actually, I can really talk about that because there is a story. I think most of us in the field do have a story, and it's very important in our careers and our work and the meaning that has. When I was 5, here's how I construe it. You know, when I was 5, my brother died. He had an accident. He fell off a rope swing and had a concussion, went into a coma, died the next morning. I remember him coming home. He wasn't supposed to go to this rope swing, but he said he was just riding his bicycle and he was not telling the truth, but he had fallen off a rope swing. We discovered later. And I remember going over to the desk, and I see it as vividly as I see the desk in front of me, reaching in with my father to get the Blue Cross card so they could go down to the hospital, which was only a few blocks away. The next morning, I was sitting at my grandparents' home and out alone on the porch. And this is where I really connect with no one should grieve alone. And the adults in the other room began crying. And I knew that something awful had happened. No one came out to the porch. No one ever hugged me. No one ever explained anything to me. For the next 20 years, or during my whole entire childhood, my parents never mentioned my brother's name. Never mentioned his name. And I lived with that, and it was inside me. And then 25 years later, when the film Ordinary People came out, the Robert Redford film, I was watching that with my wife. I was in Berkeley. I was in graduate school at Berkeley, and we're sitting in the theater watching it, and there's that scene in Ordinary People where the two boys are out on the raft, and one of them, the brother, falls off, and the brother reaches out, and he can't stop him from falling into the water, and he drowns. And at that moment, I actually had a kind of overwhelming experience. I literally saw my brother's face on the screen. I was not thinking about my brother or anything, but literally my brother's face appeared on the screen. It was I thought someone had put something in my coffee before going to the theater. It was that it's powerful. And I started sobbing. my wife had seen the parallels between the film and my own experience before that had happened in the film, and she kept looking at me. I guess she told me later. We went out to the car, and I cried for half an hour. It was just all there for me. It was amazing. You know, along the way, when I was just then becoming someone lecturing on end-of-life issues, I had been often saying, "Help the Sibs grieve. Help the Sibs grieve." And you know, now that I look back at it, I was because I had no real specialization in kids and grief, really, and I realized I was saying, "Help this Sib grieve." That it was my grief that was locked up inside. So I think that you know, that was so influential in my choice of career and what I'm interested in. Yeah, I was back in the day with Kubler-Ross and, you know, the early days of hospice and all that, and it was in the air, but it was also in my heart. So I think that's really, and I really think that, you know, with COVID isolating all the grievers now, that your work with what you're doing is so important, because we're going to have more and more isolated grievers, hidden grievers. The coronavirus pandemic, the novel coronavirus is creating a novel form of traumatic bereavement for so many people because of this isolation. But that's my story, and I really often realize that. One other little neat
Please.
thing about that, which was also very powerful. This is going to become a therapy for me soon here. But I was lecturing in my hometown. You know, the hometown boy comes back, you know, does good, you know, kind of thing, you know, at the hospice there. And I've done that a couple times. And someone came up, and he was the chief operating officer of the hospice, but he had been a monk somehow. And this only happens in hospice, where you have people who are a monk and become the chief operating officer. And he said, Dale, because I told the story of Dickie somehow. I mentioned it because I'm in my hometown, and, you know, it's all getting stirred up. He said, I was on Dickie's baseball team. And I was just overwhelmed. Somebody who knew my brother. We went out to dinner. And here's what's so amazing about Are You Grieving Alone? Because, you know, very often you're grieving alone. You're not with somebody else, but there is someone else grieving. And to know that someone else was grieving, even if you find out 50 years later, it has an impact. He told me that he had thought of my brother every day. He was a very prayerful man. He had prayed for my brother consistently. And I felt guilty at first. It's like, I haven't thought of my brother every day. I haven't prayed for my brother every day. And his wife said, oh, you're Dickie's brother. It had such significance for them that my brother's death when he was a young boy, 10 years old, had influenced him so greatly, maybe brought him into hospice.
Right. It was a formative experience for him as much as you. Yeah.
I haven't even thought of that before. Yeah. So, wow. But us coming together at that point, and the meaning it had for me, and to hear about my brother, what was he like? You know, you guys were on the team together. What positions did you play, kind of thing, and all that. It was really so deeply meaningful to me. So, yeah, that's maybe how I got here, and how he got to where he was too.
You know, reflecting in your story, it was, and we even hear it today, when there's a sibling death, everybody surrounds the parents. You know, they often don't surround the living child, and the living child is kind of left alone because the child or children don't want to inspire, evoke emotion in the parents. So they often become even more isolated. So very, very difficult and challenging. And thank you for sharing that story.
Thank you.
That was amazing.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, no, of course. So your book, tell us about your book, because that is so important about caregivers and helpers, an underserved part of our caregivers.
Yeah.
Well, from the early days, we had in Berkeley, we had the Berkeley Hospice Training Project where we developed a national mental health skills training program for hospice workers, because I was learning all this psychology, clinical psychology, and all these wonderful things, and stress management with Dick Lazarus, my teacher, and all these people. And I said, we got to try to bring these skills into hospice, because those were the early days of hospice. And we designed a program, a kind of train the trainer program, where people came from all over the country and then went back and distributed these films and manuals and all kinds of things. It was a really exciting time. I ended up, being very active, lecturing and doing workshops and retreats and writing. And I was writing about helper secrets. And I was, it was kind of a side thing that I was doing, because I was doing all this academic research, also more academic work. And then I said, this all makes sense. I want to bring it together and try to provide one book that goes from this inner journey that we're all on as helpers to the kinds of emotional involvement. How can we have balanced emotional involvement working with people who have traumas and grief and loss? And both of you know this very well, that there's a certain way we have to find to be in that situation, to be fully present. It asks more of us. And how do we do that and keep our emotional balance and maintain our resilience? So a big focus on resilience. So that was the third chapter. The fourth chapter is based on my research in self-concealment and secret keeping and how that plays out in our field. I think it's a huge factor in terms of success in psychotherapy. Bereavement, again, grieving alone, not talking to others, not having an opportunity to confide. So I have that in the book in a really deep way, because that's something I've focused a lot on in my research and my career. And then, what kind of relationship do we need to have to provide the best kind of person-centered care? Carl Rogers was a huge influence in my life. How do we provide that kind of person-centered care? And then, the communication skills we need, and then the team skills, interprofessional teams. And finally, in the final chapter, I talk about, well, how do we create a more compassionate society, one in which we can bring our empathy into the world, remain united, compassionate, especially in the face of this enormous healthcare societal worldwide challenges we're all facing right now. So the book is kind of a manual, if you will, not a manual, but a guidebook, kind of for people on their helping journey, that it's kind of has everything in one place. And that was because I had been addressing each of these different things in so many different ways in my clinical work and in my workshops and retreats, and just, getting to know what's really happening for people on their helping journeys. So that it's been the culmination of that. So this is the second edition. The first edition was like 25 years ago, and that was pretty widely distributed. And then I'm like the cicada of second editions. 25 years later, I have the second edition. And I told my publisher when I'm 100 or something, I'll have the third edition. But,
so I'm curious, is there any research that came up from your first to now that made a significant difference in your writing of the second edition?
Oh, it's just huge in positive psychology. I mean, the book is really a new book. I shouldn't even call it a second edition, honestly, but it's the psychoneuroimmunology, interpersonal neurology, mindfulness, the compassion fatigue. The list goes on of kind of constructs that are around now. And in the grief area, like I'm sure, Andy at ADEC, we've been, some of these things like disenfranchised grief really wasn't around, in 1990. These are relatively new ideas, continuing bonds and all those different constructs that we have. So yeah, there's just tremendous amount of work on burnout and resilience, and also about this emotional involvement. We have exquisite empathy. We have, the constructive zone that people are talking about. I mean, there's a lot of new ways to think about it. And so the good news is that I felt like I was on track with everything, but the new research and the new science and the new clinical understandings all extended in a beautiful way. Also, teams, tremendous work on teams. What makes for a good team? How do you create a high-functioning, compassionate team? So it was just exciting to build on what I already had. It was a great framework for the new book. So I'm pretty happy with it. It's fun. It's great to see what people are doing and to bring it together.
It is interesting how not only have our constructs, adapted over so many years in the bereavement end of life field, but even the language around it. We didn't even have the language was still really being developed in a lot of ways, how we talk about what we do, what it is that we do, and even that self-care piece. That was a new conversation. I mean, you were breaking ground in a lot of ways back then with just even talking about that.
Yeah, and it is exciting to see all the new work, self-compassion and everything else, and yeah, I agree. It's just phenomenal to see it. And back in the day, I was leading hospice support groups. I was leading groups for oncology nurses, and that's where I really learned what it's really like. And also, I have a clinical practice, so I specialize in working with bereaved. It's a very small practice, but I have had it for the last 35 years, working with bereaved parents, bereaved people, and people facing serious illness. So I'm involved with hospice when the clients who work with me don't have a positive, they die, and I'm working with them until death. So, I'm still very clinically involved, and I feel like that's my real mission too. But I just don't have enough time I can't do it. I'm a professor and I'm doing research, but my heart is in clinical work too.
I feel that recently we've actually adopted a profession for ourselves called bereavement care professionals, as opposed to grief support profession. We are bereavement care professionals. That clearly, because grief can be such a chameleon of things. It could be a divorce, it could be loss of a job, whatever. But bereavement care professional really defines what we do.
Yeah. No, I think it is good to get some definition there. I really do. But when we're talking about the other, we need to, realize we're talking about the other.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Right.
So what do you see as the burnout rate? You talk about, you have a chapter, you talk about it. What kind of, I don't want to say interventions, because your whole book is about the interventions to burnout, but what do you see most people burning out the most? Is it the emotional? Is it the not having someone to share their conversations with? What is it that you saw the most?
Well, yeah, one of the antidotes is the latter, finding someone to confide with who can, like you're trying to do or we're doing with grief, is normalize it. So we realize we can, it's not just me. You overcome the fallacy of uniqueness. But what's happening is, I think, I was at Berkeley in the day of Chris Maslach when she's still there, but in a different role now, and who's created the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is the most widely used instrument to assess burnout. It's the demoralization, the diminished caring, and the exhaustion. So these pieces, are measured in different parts of her measure scales. And when you really look at it, we get high scores on maybe one of the dimensions, and exhaustion is the key kind of dimension. But you can also think about burnout as a failure in the search for meaning, which is how Ayala Pines defined it. So it's more than just these kind of almost symptoms of of burnout. So what percentages, they vary extensively. Depends on which of the scales they're highlighting in the studies, but it's rather high, in 40, 50, 60% sometimes that people report being high or above the mean on one of these scales. So we can look at them in terms of the individual components of burnout and say they're very high. But it's really, I think, important to realize that, you know, burnout is not something that is like a disease that you have. You can be a member of the formerly burned out club. In fact, this is research verified. You can burn out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks if you have a high score on this scale, but then you can recover and you come back. And, you know, it's kind of a badge of honor because you had to be on fire to burn out, sticking with the metaphor, don't you? Have to really be on fire. So I always ask groups, I say, well, how many of you are members of the formerly burned out club? You know, and like almost everybody in the room raises their hand. So we have to get a perspective on it that burnout is largely a function of the situation we're in. We could all be burning out if we were in certain situations with high intensity, no support, no institutional support, a team that's not working together very well, and throw a bunch of very difficult situations. So burnout is when people in a give context where the focus is on the recipients of care, and you throw in some impossible situations and no support, you're going to have burnout. And it's not a weakness in the caregiver and the helper. It's something that's reflective of the environment there. And that was Chris Maslach's conclusion also, that we have to not attribute this to the individual. We wouldn't predict who's going to burn out by giving personality measures. We would predict it by looking at the situations they're in. So, you know, it's a very real phenomenon, and it's got to be taken seriously. And then we have, you know, also, you know, a kind of a different twist with it, which is compassion fatigue, which is really secondary traumatization. We could get into a research discussion here, but I see it that those is overlapping but somewhat separate. That we have burnout, we have secondary traumatization, then we have the third character in these distressing experiences we have as helpers, moral distress, which is a huge thing now for people working with COVID, because they are facing situations like, you know, triaging ventilators and making decisions about care that are so hard. And so I've been doing webinars, like I did one recently for Trinidad and for other places in the country where the caregivers, the health professionals are struggling with this. We don't have enough help. We don't have the resources we need to do the kind of care we want to do. So that's moral distress. So, you know, these are the things we need to work on preventing, and also we need to find ways to restore resilience and to enhance resilience. And the good thing in the research that's really exciting is it showing that these certain things we can do really do enhance resilience, that it can make a huge difference. So the things that we've all been aware of, you know, social support, exercise, how we think about things, mindfulness, self-compassion, these things really do make a difference. And also appreciating the meaning of what we're doing. This is an interesting thing that's really come out, this idea and research verified idea that if you can stay connected to your purpose in the work, has a huge buffering effect on the stress of it, which I think is just so cool.
I think it's tremendous, and it also is hopeful. And it's the sense that something's not just happening to me. I'm not just burned out and I'm done. Like I can do no more good. I've worked myself down. That there are things you can do to help yourself, and there are things that organizations can do to help their people who are the caregivers, and to help with burnout and all of the things that you said, that are those things that that impact our ability to be able to do what we do effectively, and to be in a place of equilibrium ourselves, in the midst of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really a lot of very encouraging, research and findings and theory today that we're landing on. It is really encouraging, and we have to just put the concepts and the ideas to work, and create kinds of structures that promote healthy caregiving, healthy teams, and that's the real challenge we have.
Yeah. Well, Dale, I tell you, this is that to me. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm walking away from this conversation with some things to look into myself, and I am looking forward to reading your book.
Well,
Thank you so much for this, and we're actually out of time. But before we end things, I did want to give you an opportunity. People who watch our episodes do want to know how they can connect with our guests, and how might people connect with you or your work, a website or some way that they might connect with you.
Well, I have a website, DaleLarsonPhD.com, where I have all the ways to connect with me. It also has access to a lot of resources. And subtitle of a book I did earlier was Models for Giving Psychology Away. This isn't about making money. It's just about really, trying to make resources available. And so I would welcome anyone contacting me through that. And my email, dlarson@scu.edu. DLARSON@scu.edu. And I just want to encourage everyone to get what you need to continue on in your helping journey and do the good work that you were meant to do. So,
Dale, thank you. We really appreciate you being a guest here at Let's Talk Death, for sharing your story, the inspiration behind your work, and your book.
Thank you.
Yep, and thank you to all of those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults. It's a program we call Actively Moving Forward, and the AMF app.
If you are a bereaved adult, join the AMF app, where adults of all ages connect to others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletters for links of future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.